Yes, hello, folks. Welcome to the bi-weekly now, Manchester United podcast. I'm your host, as always, Phil Brown. Got to start getting used to saying that. I hope you all had a nice Father's Day this weekend. Whatever you did, how was your weekend, man?
Yes, it was very good. It was very good. Nice Father's Day, nice relaxing time, and otherwise can't complain.
Yep, massive. I hope respect and admiration for all the fathers out there who are with us and the ones who unfortunately are no longer with us. I hope you all had a really, really nice day. It was quite nice myself. Didn't do much, which is most men's idea of a perfect Father's Day, just to be left alone on
Yeah.
my kids. My kids had a bunch of basketball games yesterday, so I got the day off. I
Nice.
started home most of the day. It was nice. Um, let's talk about today, of course, Gingy, with Manchester United, as there always is.
Sir.
Uh, Ekitike, of course, is now being listed as potential alternative to Gyökeres since we spoke some developments on that particular issue. We'll talk about some other potential transfer news. Talk about what Omar Barada defined as acceptable for Ruben Amorim next season. We'll discuss some other things about possibly Onana. Looks like Gordon Samuel Oakhurst we will be staying, and he, of course, has been someone that's trying to convince allegedly the Ekatike to come. Um, we'll start and talk, of course, with the transfer or with the striker situation
Yep.
relative to United, of course, and their transfer pursuit of different strikers. Liam Delap, they lost out on. I don't know how it got out that Manchester United were Gyökeres' second preferred choice. If I'm his
Hmm.
representative, I'm questioning that immediately because I don't think it's a good I don't think it's particularly good representation for your client to then go to Manchester United and start with negative equity and trying to impress United fans, then apologize for that. I'm sure he'll come out, sorry, and say that that didn't happen. That wasn't a true representation of facts. I think if you're Gyökeres, it's not crime of the century to say I would prefer
Hmm. Hmm.
Champions League football. And all I'm going to say in that, James, is I understand United stance on it saying you don't come here just for Champions League, but United for years have been able to pick off players on exactly the same, imbalance, exactly the same issue where they've been able to be predatory towards football clubs, lose players like Van Persie, what have you,
Yep.
because United can offer these types of things that other clubs can't. And considering what's been going on at Manchester United over the years and some of the terrible things that have been reported about what's been going on inside, United aren't Disneyland. We love the football club, but for professional footballers, you have to give them a reason to go there beyond where Manchester United.
Yeah, and I've thought about it a lot because obviously part of the reason that this kind of I'm somewhat questioning why it came out the way that it came out as well because I understand to a degree that part of the reason it did is United started exploring this deal, talking about it, working on it, and basically it appears likely that that they're talking to him, Arsenal are talking to him, and they were given essentially the word, well, we kind of want to see if Arsenal are going to make a move for us first before we make this decision or not, or before we decide where to go. And I don't think that's crazy when I think about that. Last year, Lenny Yoro was in the same position with us in Real Madrid. And he waited and he waited and he waited and he waited and waited until mid-July. And then they forced the issue by, agreeing a deal with his club and saying, look, we've got a deal with your club to join. Madrid aren't making an offer, and convinced him, right? Nobody holds it against Lenny Yaro. I think part of the difference, I think, is people maybe are more used to losing players to Real Madrid than Arsenal. As far as a preference goes, it feels a little bit less hurt on the ego when it's, oh, Madrid are getting a player, fine. We've lost
Yeah, of
how
course.
many of our best players have gone to Madrid? So many, right? That feels like an acceptable loss, whereas an Arsenal thing feels like a bad loss. It's like, well, wait a second. The guy wants to go to one of our direct rivals in the Premier League that, we view as like this, little brother to Manchester United, but it's not really any different. 3 weeks ago, if it had been somewhat briefed in the same way that it came out, people might have said Brian Mbumo prefers Newcastle, but United convinced him to join United in that case and said, hey, convinced him to choose United as his first choice. That's why it was even a story to come out, is because United had to convince him, right? It wasn't the default. They had to convince him, and then he made the decision to prioritize United. So the more I thought about it, the more I was like, it's not really that big of a deal. I think the part where it presents a challenge is if United are ready to make a move for him and he's not ready to accept it because he wants to see what's going on from Arsenal, then obviously United are going to have to keep looking at other players and all of that. But truth be told, outside of Cunha, who only wanted seemingly United for months, it's probably the same as every transfer we're going to go for. I mean, we were sitting there ready to get Delap when he was choosing between 4 different clubs. He wasn't in love with United, while we were chasing him and waiting for him to decide and things like that. So it's probably not a big deal, in that respect. I think the main thing is just that they can't wait forever, on something like that type of thing for it to happen. Especially as I really don't think Arsenal are going to go for him. United can't wait
Of
forever.
course,
Like
yeah,
they can't sit around
That's no
saying,
question about
"Well, if we're not that's the main thing. If you can't wait, you can't sit and say, "All right, well, we'll just wait for this player,
Of course.
a month down the road, and hopefully then we can deal with it." I mean, they've got other things to do in the meantime, anyways. But still, that's the main thing to me is you just can't, you at some point they probably need to push it or fully walk away, but they haven't walked away from it as of yet. Fully.
Yeah, look, I remember asking on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, tell me, things that you see under Ineos that stand out that you wouldn't have seen under the Glazers. And one thing I will say is, Ineos aren't going to do what happened with Frankie de Jong.
Yeah.
And if you look at last season's signings, even the ones that were not done right away, they were already lined up, ready to trigger, ready to go. So I think that is an obvious difference from what we've had before. I think they have a much more substantive knowledge of players across the world that isn't, just a veneer, of some minor stats. I think Vavel, excuse me, knows the Bundesliga very, very well, scouts very, very well informed on strikers. And I think that they'll have good alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is there just isn't an abundance of top strikers around.
Correct,
so
yeah.
the names they're relatively obvious. But look, to me, there's no way you go pay, James. If you can't get Gyökeres, there's no way you go pay anywhere close to the price Eintracht Frankfurt are asking for. Ekitike, I mean, you're talking about a kid here. Went to PSG for 35 million euros. Got immediately left out of the Champions League squad. Goes on loan to Eintracht Frankfurt. Then they pay 16.5 million euro for him. Last season, he got 15 goals in 33 games in the Bundesliga. Good, healthy, but that's his first really decent, really strong season. The season before, he had 4 goals in 14. And that, to me, is a gamble.
Yeah, it's a huge gamble. I mean, it just is factually a huge gamble. He also finished quite poorly with the 15 goals. He finished, well under his expected goals in the Bundesliga, which tends to be quite open. The Bundesliga is the highest scoring league in football. It's where the goals happen. And, we've seen with plenty of occasions, unfortunately for United, that hasn't quite panned out exactly the same way. So it is a huge risk. It's not to paint that every player that comes from the Bundesliga won't work, because there's plenty that have and there's plenty that haven't. But there's always a risk in transitioning leagues. There's some leagues that transition better. There's some that don't on average. And when you're buying any young player, there's a risk involved in these things. And, when United went for Rasmus Højlund years ago on this, they made a decision to not pay the money for Harry Kane, not pay the money for Victor Osimhen, and go for the younger striker with the potential that was supposed to be 40 million and then ended up paying 72 million. And that price is a factor when you talk about young players and their performance, because it puts expectations on them that they shouldn't have. It puts the need for them to play. You know, when you buy a guy for 20 million, they can be on the bench. They can be rotated for half the season. They can, play 1,500 minutes and nobody's going to think about it. You know, if you bought a young striker for 20 million, they can rotate with Xerxes. They can rotate with Cunha. They can rotate with Mbumo. They can do all of those things and nobody would think anything of it. And you give them that chance. If you go and you're paying, the quoted price right now is 85 million pounds, which is absolutely insane. I mean, you're talking about the amount of money that United paid for Paul Pogba, who was probably the best midfielder in the world when they bought him. And even then, it was a lot of money. They paid 89 million at the time, and he was winning things, and he went and won a World Cup while he was at United and all of that. But it's like it's an insane amount of money, and you can see how it weighs on him. And obviously, it weighed really heavy on Rasmus Højlund. It weighed really heavy on Antony. It weighed really heavy on Jadon Sancho. The big purchases have a really hard time very often with this because they have to come in and perform. They have to come in and be great right off the bat for that. When you're talking about that kind of money, the pressure is always there. And part of the reason for that is when you spend that kind of money, you're not buying two players. You can only get one. When you buy a young guy for 20 million, you can buy another player. It doesn't prevent other business. So they have that. You buy a striker at 80 million, you can't buy another one next season. You can't. You're that's it. That's the guy. That's why we didn't really get many forwards in the last years. All the money spent on Højlund and Antony and Mount that went to nothing. It's a big risk in that respect.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. It's a huge risk. First of all, United don't have 85 million to spend, James, right?
Yeah.
On a striker, which is it's not an option.
Mhm.
Secondly, even if they did, Ekitike at best is worth half that to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
And there's a big risk bringing players in who have never played in the Premier League.
Yep.
Who, there's going to be an adjustment period that United don't have the time to wait for.
Mhm.
And to me, you're saying a player with a similar risk profile as Rasmus Højlund. It could work out great, but what if it doesn't?
Yep.
Because if it doesn't, Ekitike's one decent season at Frankfurt will be forgotten about.
Yeah, you won't get your money back. There's no.
How would you value him a year from now if he struggles in the Premier League? If you look at PSG win the Champions League, we talked about this. I mean, they had Kolo Muani at what, 90 million euro or something. Goncalo Ramos, they paid a fortune for him too. These players don't even play, James.
Yeah.
And they replaced them. Oh, 90 million pound striker doesn't work out, replace immediately. Right? And that's who wins Champions Leagues.
Yep.
The question for United is, can they compete anymore, James, at the highest level? And because United have this albatross of their history that demands they compete, demands they win European Cups and Premier Leagues and what have you. But take a look at City spending. Take a look at what Liverpool are spending. United aren't in that hemisphere, James. I mean, United just, even if they had the PSR room, they don't have the money.
Yep.
I mean, you can have all the PSR room you want, but they don't have the money. It doesn't matter. And I'm looking at that going, we will talk about this in a minute, a bit later, but what Barada said is an acceptable benchmark, an acceptable season for Ruben Amorim next season, which I think is fair, what he said, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But maybe it's time we have to really start adjusting expectations here and saying, right now, it's not realistic to expect Ruben Amorim to compete with a Liverpool, City, and maybe even an Arsenal who have resources that United just don't have. Now, we can sit here and lament and argue and be about why this is the case. We know why this is the case, but that doesn't change the reality. And, this also brings me back to the Bruno Fernandes thing. Like, I see all these teams that United are supposed to be competing with strengthening, like legitimately strengthening.
Yeah.
And had United have been in a position where they had to have sold Bruno Fernandes, I'm not confident. This is one of the reasons why I didn't want him sold. Just you're sitting that money in the bank. You're confident that United are going to be able to go out and recruit players of a certain level. Spread that out over 2 or 3 players, and I'm not, because I'm looking at this United have lost out on their, assuming Gyökeres doesn't come, their 2 striking targets, Delap and Gyökeres. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, so once you start going down my list, what are we looking at here, Mateta?
Right. I mean, that is the thing, right? And it's like it's somewhat understandable. You finish 15th. This is where you're at, and I think we were talking last time about this is why we have to consider the this being a bit of a, that this has to go in stages, and you can't mess that up. And I gotta say, one of the things that really can mess it up is going and spending 80 to 100 million on one player and having it not work out on a young player. Like, that can blow up the entire plan, the entire rebuild. Because you spend that money and you miss Europe next year, you can't buy any players. Your money's gone. That's it, and you won't recoup it. But regardless, yeah, I mean, look, this is the challenge. One, I think that's why they're remaining in the race for Gyökeres, because I think the feeling at the end of the day is that Arsenal are playing games with this. Um, Berta, the new sporting director, has is his way of doing it is to approach on two players at the same time in these positions. But it really does seem like Šeško is going to be the one they end up going for, because it's the one their manager really wants. And so I think United are kind of
That's
cognizant
from a
of that.
perspective. If you're Arsenal, I mean, that's what you should be doing.
Yeah, and unfortunately for United, if a player prefers to go to a team that's in a better position right now, that is in a better state right now, that has, especially when a player's older, right? Gyökeres is not 22, so saying, I'm 27, I've been in the Champions League the last few years, I want to keep playing at a highest level is understandable. It's more understandable than a young player who makes that choice over just one season or something like that. But regardless, I think that's why they're hanging around it, because the alternates are not great. You go to Mateta. I think Mateta's a good player in the Premier League. I think he's a good player. But you're looking at Crystal Palace. They're in Europe. They're going to ask for 50, 60 million as well. And so you're going to pay this premium. And then you start to go, well, what actually is out there that we could get? And your answer starts to become nobody. And you start to think the value for money is so bad that can you even buy someone at that point? And that's why this could take a while, because then you're starting to compromise and say, shoot, how good can we do the ceiling if we get Cunha and Mbumo and we spend money elsewhere, but we can't get a striker? How good can we do? There's a big limit to how well you can do if that becomes the reality of the situation.
But to me, that is an indict. That would be a major failure of any James.
For sure, I agree. They got to make it happen. Yeah,
you have to provide a football team. The first principle, priority number one, is making sure you have a football team on the field that can compete. That's the whole point of this sporting excellence, right? Anyone can fail, but not anyone can succeed, and that's why they're in here and paid what they are and came with the reputation that they have. Every couple of years we hear the same thing: rebuild, cultural reset, culture. And it's not really the team that needs to be rebuilt first, it's the club.
Yeah,
because we keep talking about this in relation to the team.
Yeah,
but culture doesn't come from the team, it comes from the club.
Yep.
Cultural reset doesn't come from the team, it comes from the club. Rebuilds are you're just rearranging furniture in a house that's fallen down, and eventually, after a year or two, when the roof's leaking and everything is wrecked and destroyed, let's just get new furniture. No, you need to fix the foundations. You need to fix before you do anything else, and we keep doing this over and over and over again. And this is because in order for it to be the club, the people talking about cultural resets, they're not talking about them. They're talking about if it's coming from inside the club, they're not talking about themselves resetting culturally. They're talking about players, but they should be pointing the finger at themselves, because most people, when they appraise a problem, never include themselves as part of the issue, right? That's just human nature, right? And so, but anyone can see that United's problem is is an issue with what happens at an executive level. And look, James, I'm going to be honest, mate. I don't mean to get just not say anything politically, your allegiance either way, but when you see what happened between Musk and Trump, right? This is predictable. This is what billionaires do. Okay, they have massive egos,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't share power at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't share it well.
Yeah.
And eventually, you get into a situation where you have competitive ideas, and
Yep.
if they are orthogonal to each other, if these are completely antithetical to each other, it's just a matter of time before they start.
Yeah.
It's not a harmonious
Mm-hmm.
situation. And
Yeah.
when you hear things like the Glazers said they were upset that Ratcliffe said we would have been busted by Christmas, James, I don't think United can fix this football club until that situation is fixed. I
Yeah.
honestly, like, I think you can improve. I think you could get United to a sixth or maybe a fourth,
Yep.
but United will not be competitive at the highest level with the best run football clubs in the world until this situation gets fixed, because these are ideologies that completely opposed to each other. And
Mm-hmm.
right now, United still look like a football club whose major decisions are being made at the whim of a billionaire. If his views oppose those of his team, then he's the one. Because I don't see any continuity, James. I don't see, oh, you know what? They've got a playing style that's defined that on day one, or, there still looks to be decisions that are being made that don't look like they're the end result of an evaluation process. That look very much like, you know, I don't like Dan Ashworth and the things he's saying. Get him out.
Right.
This is what billionaires. Maybe I'm wrong, but I still don't see any identity. Like we've talked before, the Ten Hag and Amorim thing. There's no way you can have a playing style and then have it compatible with Ten Hag and Amorim if you're led by that.
Mm-hmm.
And it still looks to me like, the set piece coach was gone. These are. I think he was an Ineos appointment too, if I remember correctly. And I'm looking at these decisions going, it's hard for me to I still feel like these decisions, these big decisions inside United, are still coming down to the ego of a billionaire.
Yeah, and perhaps. I mean, I definitely think for sure at least for the beginning stages of things, which unfortunately carried over into affecting this season that we just had quite a bit, for sure. Unfortunately, I do agree and think that, there was too much of them involved. But part of the problem I think that happened with that as well is because this conflict between the Glazers and Ineos, maybe not conflict, right? But it's a factor where you have this sort of, I don't know what you would call it, like maybe it's uncomfortable truce or something like that. And the fact of the matter is, it means that Ineos obviously have to be very, very active because they're running the football club per this agreement and these types of things. And there's probably a bit too much owner involvement. And obviously, I've said many times, it doesn't really matter to me who owns the football club. I don't want them, making those decisions, because you don't want it to be the whims of a non-football guy who's just a big money guy who's, no matter what industry they're in, they're not the right guy to run the club, right? At the end of the day, they're not the right guy to run a football club. They're a right guy to run a business, but not the right guy to run a football club. And that certainly has to improve. But I think a salient point to this, because it's hard to know the effects that these things have, is that one way or another, there has to be something sorted out between the two groups of owners for the long term and what's going to happen here. Because I don't think it can continue endlessly in its present state. In fact, 2 months from now, some of the things that were in the original agreement that was set will expire, and the situation will change in mid-August on all of it. And so there does have to be some sort of evolution there, because it is hard to know how much does that affect things when you have it set up this way? How much does it affect, even though, yes, of course, you have this 3-man voting board and Ineos have control, but Joe Glazer's sitting on it. What if he does disagree? And you have to maintain a truce between the two parties involved. And how does that affect the thinking? Because you can't just, bull rush the guys who own 70% of the club. And even if you technically have control, it
Well,
doesn't
they
quite
only own
work
like
that way.
28% or 29%, isn't it?
Yeah. No. What I mean is that, like, Jim,
Yeah,
so
I
he's
know.
running the football club. He can't, these
And there's
guys
a
who own
reason why they still
70.
kept the majority
Yeah.
shareholder
Yeah.
position, James. It didn't become minority because they
Correct.
still wanted control of the ultimate
Correct.
outcomes and the big decisions. And
Right. So that affects things. And so I agree with you in the respect that it's better, but I I'm certain that has to be resolved as well, and it cannot continue in its present state, because to me it's like a shift in the right direction, but it's still a bit in limbo. And it's kind of just like you say, though, it's as above so below. When things above are a certain way, they will always reflect themselves a bit down the line. As it is in your mind, so it is, in reality. And that's the same thing with any sort of group, or an organization like this. When things at the top, if they're not 100% clean, if they're not 100% straight, and everybody push in the same direction, there will be conflict all the way through the entire thing down to the bottom.
yeah,
And that does have to be resolved.
you're going to get a lot of friction if you don't have alignment.
Yeah.
Diversity
Yeah.
viewpoint is fine if there's a
Yeah.
consensus on the look. Look, this is where we're going. This is what we want to do. Okay, we have complete consensus on our goal. There's going to be some difference, some different viewpoint at the table about how we should get there, but we're all agreed that we're going in the same direction. That's healthy, that you have people that have different perspectives, that disagree on things, and that's what a healthy company looks like. I remember listening to someone like Jeff Bezos saying that when he would go into meetings, he would make sure he would speak last, because he knew if he spoke first, that everybody else at the table would just echo what he said.
Right.
And so it's really important that, one, there's complete alignment, or two, the incentives. Human beings work towards the goals they're incentivized to achieve. That's it, right? So the incentive structure has to be aligned with football goals. Now, that's difficult because the curated culture in a business is derivative of the priorities of the owners. That's it. What do they want? What do they value? What is important? What defines success? What does this guy, when Joe Glazer or Avil Glazer looks at me, what do they want to see?
Yeah.
Is it someone that is an exceptional football guy, or someone that is an exceptional business guy? If I can be exceptional at one, it'll be business that will give me the rewards here. That'll get me, that'll result in my, result in my success here, and result in, achieving my financial rewards and everything else that I'm incentivized for. This is the problem. And when your first principle is profit, everything is a casualty to that. Everything. Do I want to spend an extra 50 million to buy this player that might win us the Champions League? Nah, because there's only 10 million difference between winning it and not winning it in terms of prize money. That's a business decision. I don't really give a shit whether fans want to win the Champions League or not. These are all business decisions to me. Do I, start to prioritize selling academy products because it reflects better on our bottom? That's business. Right? Now, I understand there's a business element to this, but the clubs that win, the PSGs and what have you, they're not there to make money, James. They're there because they define success by what happens on a pitch. Until that becomes a priority at United, and that won't be the priority at United until you get rid of the people who changed the definition of success at United, and those are the majority shareholders. And I'm not blaming everything on them, but they changed the definition of success once Ferguson left and made it a business definition, not a football one. That's why United are in this mess.
Yep.
And so this is a football club who happens to be a business, not a business who happens to play football. There are big differences.
Yep.
And until the first principle is winning trophies and what happens on the pitch, and then make money off that, like Real Madrid and what have you do. This is always going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah, for sure. I can only agree with that.
If you have two competing cars on the market, one car company decides, look, I take enormous pride in the finished good. I am a car fanatic, and I will compromise some profit to put an exceptional product on the market because this is what nourishes me. Then you have another company that says, look, I just want to get a product on the market that people will buy twice. I don't give a shit how it looks. I don't give a shit if it doesn't compete with Ferrari. I just want to get a product on the market that's just good enough that people will buy. United are not the first one, they're the second one. It used to be the first one.
Yeah.
And so then you're asking the managing directors of both these companies to compete with each other. Look, they're in the same market, but that's about it.
Yeah.
They're not trying to compete with each other.
Yep.
They have different models of success. And so how do you so when we talk about culture, that culture is a derivative of that exact mindset, James.
Yeah, for sure, and it won't really change. And that is the underlying thing that, of course, has to change. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, my friend. Let's. I was looking at an article I was reading in Italy about United showing. It was in Corriere dello Sport. United in looking at Atalanta goalkeeper Karsecki, young goalkeeper, 34 million. Of course, John Murta is out there. He does sort of fit the profile of someone that United would like to sign, certain physical profile, attributes, what have you. You think there's any possibility Onana could leave us somewhere?
I think it'll be difficult. I do, because essentially, again, when decent chunky wages, a lot left on his amortization, it's hard to sell Onana, especially when he probably doesn't particularly want to leave. He seems to be fairly settled in Manchester and all of that as well. A lot of the stuff from Saudi was just kind of noise that didn't really amount to much in terms of concrete interest and offers and things like that. So you have to look at, the only way he goes is if someone's willing to pay 30 million and take on 175 to 200,000 a week in wages for a player who's underperformed and all of that. And the likelihood of that is pretty low. It's more likely that Bayindir will leave this summer for sure. I think at this stage, it's more likely. And that could definitely allow for the purchase of a young goalkeeper, I should say, to come in. Might not be the worst idea either. I'm not saying Onana's like, I'm not the biggest fan of Onana. I mean, I actually quite like him, but we've talked about it a lot over the course of the years. Like, that's just, the mistakes get so rough. But it's not the worst idea, I would say, for a young keeper to also have Onana, someone who's more experienced, still being at the club, regardless. Sometimes the competition helps and is healthy both ways. I mean, we saw at times with Romero and De Gea how good it was to have two experienced goalkeepers at the club at that point in time. That was quite a good combination. And I think that it's not the worst thing in the world, I guess I would say, to bring in a young goalkeeper who, they make mistakes. Young goalkeepers make mistakes. They all do. They make mistakes, to have another keeper there. So yeah, I think United are definitely in the market for another keeper, but it'll probably be, I would say, a younger one because of costs. Like, they're not going to be able to afford a Donnarumma like we talked about.
Well, there's no human being, there's no goalkeeper on the market that doesn't make mistakes. I was listening to something that Roger Federer was saying, which was really interesting. He was talking about human error and failure and that's in everything. And he was saying, of all the tennis matches he played, he won about 80% of them. And in those games, he won 54% of the points. Like, so 46% of the points I lost. Okay. And we tried for perfection, but it's not there. We're just we're never going, and inevitably a human brain fixates on the negative. So I don't expect United to go out and saying, when we talked about this last week with Garnacho, there's just no one you can sign that doesn't make mistakes, right? That's just part of life. I can take the mistakes, James. I
Hmm.
can take 2 or 3 mistakes over a course of a season. What
Yep.
I struggle with Onana with is, like, for example, when United played Chelsea, palms the ball out to Enzo.
Yeah.
And these are fundamentals.
Yeah. Those are not mistakes. They're
Yeah,
actually just
this is
something's wrong with the way
it,
you're
it,
playing. Yeah.
it's a feature, not a bug,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Yep.
so that's going to keep showing up.
Correct. Yep.
And so to me, it's like, you know, if you go with someone like Onana, knowing what the 2 seasons that he's just had, you're taking a huge risk because you own the third season because you're no longer
Yeah.
surprised. You're taking account,
Yep.
you're in possession of all the information. Same with Hoyland. You go
Yep.
into the season next season and Hoyland's sitting at the end of, beginning of January, he scored 2 goals. You own it. You decided, you
Hmm.
knew that,
Yep.
right? And I understand that sometimes it's not that black and white because you can't sell players that easily.
Yeah.
But to me, United have to send at least a number 2 that's very, very capable of being a number 1. Operating
Yes,
under the
I
premise
would
that you
agree.
might
Yep.
need to leave Onana out and this guy's ready to step in. And he's not just, some 37-year-old goalkeeper who's been on the bench for the last 6 years that you're just filling a bench with. It has to be someone that can come in, that can really push Onana. And if you need to leave Onana out, you have someone that you can put in that isn't just a backup, but someone that has the potential to be your number 1. Those
Yeah.
goalkeepers are not cheap, but I do believe that that is a very, very important and
I
underlooked
agree.
signing. And I think, for Bayindir and his career, I think he should also move on.
For sure. For sure. I agree. It's definitely something they have to do and get hold of, and I think it's the right time to do that. They've been looking at a number of them. Obviously, like one you mentioned there, they've looked at Lamans. We've talked about him before. There's a few that they could bring in that I think are pretty high potential that wouldn't necessarily be super expensive, and that's something they have to get to. But it's also a reason why you have to be smart about where you're spending the rest of the money that's in the budget, and not go crazy over the top elsewhere, because you really have to make sure there is some money left over for some things like this. I understand you don't want to go out and buy a 60 million goalkeeper on the market. I don't think there's any goalkeeper worth 60 million on the market right now. I don't think, because I wouldn't, they make mistakes. They do things, we talked about Emi Martinez and said, look, yeah, if you sold Onana and you brought in Emi Martinez, it'd be an upgrade, but for the cost of it, uh, probably worth it, but it's not like this crazy difference. It's not like it's not like insanely better for all the costs. So, there just has to be enough money to get a good young goalkeeper in that could be that guy with some time. And I think that would be really important as well, for sure.
Let me ask you about what Omar Barada said that would be acceptable for Ruben Amorim next season. It's around 6 was what was said, which to me is not unreasonable
Yeah.
and is probably a fair appraisal of where United are at. And
Yep.
some people getting upset. Oh, they should be aiming higher. This is bare minimum. What he's talking about is a bare minimum. And
Mm-hmm.
secondly, United are not going to fix this football club and this football team in this window,
Nope.
and they shouldn't expect quick fixes either. Okay, in order for something to have structural integrity that you can trust going forward, it has to be built right. You can't cut corners. You
Yep.
can't. United are not going to catch Liverpool and City this summer, right?
Yep.
Um, and like we talked about before, you have to flatten that curve, your performance curve. So I think that is reasonable, and
Yeah.
anything less than that, I would be really disappointed, James.
I agree. I am happy that he said it too, because I think it's important to have people in charge who are realistic about where we are and not trying to cover that up and say, no, every year, not give you that fake, every year United should be challenging for league titles. Like,
Yeah,
thank
I
you
know.
for that, but come on, all right, it's not going to
Mm.
happen. So I think it's a good estimation. I think it's where they should be, and I think that's going to be, where they look at it and say, all right, we need to do what we have to do to get us there and not make big mistakes. I think it is reasonable. I think if you add Cunha and Bumo get some kind of striker in, you already have a team that could probably do that. I think that you're obviously needing to further address the midfield, center backs, but those things are probably going to take to another window. Maybe another left back or something like that, depending on some of these young guys. But I think those are things you're going to have to solve in another window because the money's just not there for thing to do this summer. But when you look at how bad United were at scoring goals last season, if you add three good attackers to that, it is wild to look at because again that this thing about the difference between 5th and 17th, right? But the fact of the matter is, adding they scored so few goals in the league. You
Mm-hmm.
add guys like Cunha, 15 goals, and Bumo, 20 goals, a striker who scored another 15, 20 or more. Realistically, if you can get up to even scoring 60 goals, you're in the top 6 at that point. It's not that far off. It wasn't like those guys are scoring 80, 90 like Liverpool at the top of the table. So they can do it. And I think it's a very achievable number, but I also think it's definitely where we should be.
Yeah, it's a bare minimum. I do expect it will be significantly better next
Yeah.
season, but I'm not stupid, James. Unless United bring in, to me, 3 or 4 players that, I mean, we talked about them in Bumo, and they seem to be confident that deal will get done.
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of price, and it does seem like Bumo is not considered anyone other than United.
Right. So United have the kind of the leverage on this deal to just wait it out a little bit here.
Yeah, which I'm okay with right now. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not getting up every day checking my phone to see if he's signed, right? I mean,
Yeah.
maybe I would have when I was younger,
We
but
still have a
that's
couple weeks till players are returning. It really isn't the rush necessarily that it's made out to be. If the player's giving you that priority, he's on holiday, he's watching the F1 in Toronto. It's like it's not a big deal.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
most players are on holiday unless they're playing at the Club
Mm.
World Cup. I'm sure these players must be thinking, Jesus
I
Christ,
don't know
seriously?
who's at the Club World Cup because I can't be asked to watch them
Oh, mate.
this competition, whatever that thing is.
No, I don't. It's honestly, I was sitting watching The Exorcist it was Saturday or something, instead of watching the football. I'm like, I was I was watching The Exorcist, and the lady lifts the phone. She presses 0 for operator. I'm like, shit, man, remember we used to have operators. Used to be able to
Yeah.
press 0, and I'm like, I'm Googling, we still have operators. Yeah, so instead of watching Bayern Munich put 10 past Auckland, although they did put
Yeah.
10 past Arsenal in the Champions League, so
About the same level, I guess, right?
sorry.
It's crazy though. I do have to say that's nuts looking at and reading these stories about these guys who's like, is like a shift manager at a warehouse and he's playing in this competition. And it's like, what is the point of this competition? What on earth is going on here? Like, what are they doing?
Look, I respect the footballs for everyone, and I
Yeah,
respect the fact that clubs deserve the opportunity to see some of the riches, but there has to be competitive balance. I
right.
mean, people are paying in the watches, and it has to be embarrassing for everyone involved. Although I have to say, Bayern shithousery is a bit.
I mean, it is
I
funny
was
in a
gonna
sense.
say,
Like,
do you have any? No, I think I remember Oliver Kahn once some kid was taking penalties against him for charity or something. He saved all 5.
it's just how it is. It's no
Yeah,
nonsense,
yeah.
German efficiency, right?
I just laugh. But yeah. So anyway, there's plenty of time left to get these. I think
Yep.
United by the end of this window, I would say there. I mean, another 3 players. I think
Yeah.
they'll send a midfielder, 2 more forwards.
Yeah, and
And
Bumo, a striker, a midfielder, and probably goalkeeper, I would say, is probably the minimum that they could get. They
big
should be able
season
to.
next season for Mr. Manning
Yeah. Yeah.
because World Cup a year from now, James, and
Yes.
for him, he has to understand clearly what he needs to be doing every week to be part of
Yeah.
the Marines team, whether he agrees with that, whether he's capable of doing it, or else he has to make a decision this summer. Like
Mhm.
that is, for him, we talk about Garnacho and everyone else, the obvious ones. I, I would be really, it would hurt me. I would be really
Mhm.
upset when I saw. We all saw Manu in his first game against Everton. He was transformative. I think he's a brilliant player. Technically, very very good. He's a player that scores goals in key moments. Very composed.
Yep.
Um, maybe isn't as bad. I thought he was bad. He was deep line midfielder. Maybe he could play higher because he does score quite a lot of goals when he's in the advanced positions. Um, big decision for him to make this summer.
Yeah, and I agree with the sense that he needs to know what he has to do to get there. And I think like we talked about last time, I think it would be great, not that he's the same player, if he understands how to become like the Bruno replacement in the long term, in a sense, because you don't need necessarily a like for like in replacing Bruno when you're adding attackers and goals across the entire team. But in the long term, if he can be the guy who can play in the midfield and he can play a little more forward and learn to really do whatever is needed in that role well, then I think he's a player who has that potential to be good enough to do that and to be that type of guy. So hopefully we see a good step in that direction where, there's games he starts and Bruno actually gets a rest. And there's games where, he can play deeper and Bruno moves up and vice versa. And they can become more of a platoon as a part of this. And he can fit in there and impact games really well. So I think that's the plan. So hopefully we get to see it and that it does come to pass in that way.
I could want to also say well done to young Tito Obi for getting a special
Yes.
award at the Maurice Ravello, previously known as the Toulon tournament. Denmark finished third. Did not get player of the tournament, as some people had mentioned, but he did get a special award in recognition for his performances. Very encouraging and perhaps part of the striker conundrum going forward. And
Mm-hmm.
he might see United struggles as an enormous opportunity for him. He still doesn't look ready to me,
Yeah.
James, but
Yep.
that can change quickly. And, you know, it is imperative that United nurture and develop their own strikers, given the fact that the scarcity of strikers in the market, and he's definitely someone that offers some hope.
Yeah, and another reason I'm not 100% banking on, but another reason I would rather get an established striker because you have players like him to learn off of. They bought young Enzo Kanabuyik, we talked about last time, who was going to go off on loan. You've got a really good talent in Cheeto and a good player you've just bought, and a decent player in Xerxes that we all want to see what happens. You need someone experienced over the top of them to learn off of, to take the pressure off of, and but also not to necessarily not block the path in the future too, because Cheeto looks like he does have the capability to be something quite special. I mean, I it was just a preseason, I know, but I was still completely blown away by the difference between his levels and the performances otherwise of not to be mean of Rasmus Højlund in that position, even in those preseason games. It was quite something to see. Um, but I did want to ask you a question then, because just was one more thing to touch on the sales.
Where's my lawyer?
On the players that are needed out, one that continues to be a bit of a problem. There's some movement on Anthony. There's some movement on Højlund. Batiste are coming in for Anthony. They're making kind of complicated deals, but it might actually suit all parties. These things could get done. Højlund, there's interest from Italy. Garnacho seems to be turning down deals outside of England, including from his former manager Eric Ten Hag at Leverkusen when they have all this money. Um, I believe he's going to find himself in quite a wake-up call pretty soon, because Chelsea are pretty much buying anybody but him right now. Napoli are buying anybody but him. Just while we're on this, they're being linked to Jack Grealish over him. There's not a lot of clubs that are actually interested in Alejandro Garnacho or rate him at the level that he seems to think of himself. And when
James,
you start turning these moves down, it can have a real danger on your career. I mean, I'm not comparing it exactly, but we're seeing like with Jadon Sancho, it's dangerous to start to say, I'm too good for that.
yeah, look, first of all, if I'm representing Alejandro Garnacho, I'm not saying you to Chelsea
Yeah.
because you could for the Garnacho that played the last 4 or 5 months for United would not have played for Chelsea.
Yeah. Yep.
And he could very easily be sitting here in a situation a year from now right? Now, bear in mind what we just said, the World Cup. He'll want to go with Argentina, right?
Mm-hmm.
He needs to play.
Yep.
And he's not at a consistent level enough yet where he's going to play week in, week out for the top teams.
Yep.
And I think he would go to La Liga if it's one of the top 2 or 3 teams.
Yeah.
Outside of that, getting outside the Premier League, you're taking a drop. Maybe if
Mm-hmm.
PSG or something comes in for him, okay. But you're right. There isn't a lot of teams. The level that Garnacho's at is not at a Real Madrid yet. He
No.
may get there one day. But the level that he's at, most of those teams can't afford, big money for a player
Yeah.
like there's some certain things that he has a right to feel upset about that have happened at United. I understand that. And as I said a week ago, I don't think he's done anything that's unforgivable. I'm not saying that Ruben Amorim shouldn't move him on and it shouldn't have a consequence at United, or it's not enough to move him on as a footballer at Manchester United. That's fine. I just don't think his character should be, I think it's character defining that he's done stupid shit. But it's not exactly a market awash with cash. It's a small number of teams. So unless you're going to go to Saudi Arabia, unless you're going to go to 1 or 2 or 3 of the top teams. Garnacho was available in January. PSG decided to buy Kvaratskhelia instead.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
This is the thing, is like, okay, where do you go, kid? And and whoever you go to, if you want to go to a top team, top profile, then to me, you have to make sure you play. It wouldn't surprise me. Someone like Villa, because Marcus Rashford had to face a similar dilemma in January, and that, look, in order to get out, you're not going to have your pick of top, because this is an emergency situation.
Yeah.
It's exigent, and he needs to get out. Garnacho put himself in a bad situation because there's enormous pressure on his agent to bring these offers. United don't go looking for these offers. His agent does.
Correct. Yep.
It's his job to bring these offers to United. But his agents had months to do this, because he would have known in January that this is a very real possibility.
Yep.
Where are these offers? See, this is what I mean. Garnacho should have been doing everything the last 4 or 5 months to, not for United, but
for
as an advertisement for other teams.
Yeah.
Yes, this is what you do. Yeah. This is why, same thing with Sancho. It's so self-defeating to keep yourself out of the team for 5 months. Like, it just doesn't help you. And so for me, like, it wouldn't entirely surprise me if he doesn't get sold.
Yeah, me neither, for that reason, just because there's not going to be a lot of clubs interested for the type of money. We see that. It's difficult. It was interesting you mentioned Villa, just on a last point on this, because I was thinking about that. And, they have their own issues. We'd very likely have to buy somebody from them to send someone away. What would you say to someone, this is purely an opinion, what would you say to buying somebody if it was an affordable deal like Ollie Watkins, who's Premier League experienced, scored 15 goals, I think 4 or 5 seasons in a row in the Premier League, if he was available on a good price? He's older. He's obviously not a top striker, but
United aren't a top football club anymore,
right?
So you have someone like Ollie Watkins that's available that gets 15 goals a season that you don't have right now. You take it.
Yeah.
He's not the solution for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
He's Mr. Right now. I'm okay with that, because James, what comes after the likes of Ekatike, Osman, and everything, it's not glamorous.
No, it's not.
And people are going to get a bit frustrated at the profile of what United are going to have to end up pursuing. Yeah. You get someone like Ollie Watkins that gets you 15 goals, thereabouts in the Premier League. You snatch your hand off that. Yeah. I can't remember Liverpool sending players like Ricky Lambert and stuff for the same reason. United are in the position they're in right now. And so I wouldn't be completely against something like that happening, but be interesting to see what does happen with that, because obviously, Ollie Watkins started to get left out a bit towards the end of the season for a player Manchester United are trying to get rid of.
By the way, had his name printed while a few others didn't. I wondered about that. It's
what
kind
happened?
of an interesting. Well, apparently in the jersey reprint, there was a few players whose names were left off. Anthony, Sancho, but not Marcus. His name was printed on these jerseys and presumably is numbered. I don't know. I'm just curious what happens there.
Yeah. Well,
Here the curiosity I have is this: if United return for training and Marcus Rashford is sold, he'll be at training, won't he?
well, it has to
Because
be.
he wasn't kicked out. He wasn't kicked out of training previously, even when he wasn't playing. He was there. It wasn't like the situation when Sancho was sent to train with the kids. Nothing like that happened. So
James,
presumably he might be here in 3 weeks from now, back with the
well,
team.
there was a story was out, I don't know, the other day about Amorim was told to have reconciliation talks, everything. Up until a few days ago, that wasn't true. That hadn't happened. So,
Right.
like, the reality is, United could cancel his contract if he was that much, if he was
Right.
that toxic.
Yeah.
Offer mutual termination, just
Yeah.
go. But they
Yeah.
won't, because obviously they understand he's worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
If you can't sell him, you have to. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
I mean,
I'd reconcile. I mean,
well, they
I'd
won't have a
reconcile.
choice. But James, I understand people have their own views on this. I get that. But he still, for my money, the best football club.
True. He is. He is.
So,
And I
we'll
don't think
see.
he. That's just my opinion, but I don't think he'd turn down playing at United again if things were reconciled
By
in
the
that
way,
case. But
was not that I think Ross Barkley should be criticised for this because he's on holiday and enjoying himself, but really interesting how some players are celebrated with humor and lauded for getting mashed.
Yeah, I know.
And their
Just
own personal
depends.
time, and they're allowed to socialize and party in a certain way, and some players aren't.
Yeah, I guess it depends on their clothing, depends on the type of things they
Yeah,
wear, doesn't it?
understand. But
Yeah,
and I think Ross Barkley should be allowed to be able to let us,
exactly.
to proverbially let his hair down and enjoy himself. So what? I
Yeah.
just think everyone should be allowed that right every once in a while. All right, meeting. We'll be back
Alrighty.
later on in the week, folks. Drop me an email at beyondthepitch@gmail.com and let me know if you have any things that you would like to see us put in the show going into next season, changes. We're looking at a few things, try to change some of the format a bit. So we're open to ideas. Appreciate all the downloads, likes, retweets, and everything else. We'll be back on Thursday. We'll take some of your questions on Thursday as well. We'll cover those things. All the best, folks. Take it easy. Cheers
See you
to you.
later.
See ya.